Was a method that Nixon used to chase people he didn't like, which included hippies, people against the war. So he got legislation passed that put these substances into Schedule 1. No known medical use, high possibility for addiction. It was the most researched psychedelic on the planet.
There's also a general stigma against anything that brings people pleasure, anything that brings them more of a feeling of freedom and autonomy.
Well, I was involved in high dose research from 1961. That's not how much you take, it's how much you're willing to let go of when the push to let go happens. Personal identity, their connection to their own body, what's the nature of time, is there death? Any culture that had access to consciousness altering plants or mushrooms used them.
Thanks, guys, for doing this. I have to say, I'm a general fan of plant medicine. I think it works wonders. I can't say I've done a ton of microdosing, although I've taken microdoses before. But I do have a lot of questions, and I'm very curious what your research has shown and what your experiences have been. But I first want to start off just with, I think there's so many people within the community of fans of psilocybin or LSD or these medicines that, can look at them and say, why are these illegal when something like alcohol and cigarettes and so many things that are clearly detrimental to your health are legal? So where was it along the way that these substances got such a bad reputation?
Well, it took a lot of work from the federal government. I will tell you that. The legislation in the 60s that led to the end of research and the end of use, except illegally for millions of people, basically was a method that Nixon used to find a way to arrest and chase people he didn't like, which included hippies, included people against the war. He also didn't like blacks, he didn't like Jews. And he got legislation passed, pretty much unread, that put these substances into Schedule 1. Schedule 1 says no known medical use and high possibility for addiction. That's the definition of Schedule 1. At the time it, quote, had no medical possibilities, it was the most researched psychedelic on the planet. This was LSD. It is actually, curiously, an anti-addictive substance, of which there are not that many. So it had nothing to do, medicine had nothing to do with research, had nothing to do with health. It was strictly a political move. The world of medical research and so forth kind of saw the way the world was going and said, well, if the law says it's bad, if we say it's bad, we won't get in trouble.
There's also a general stigma against anything that brings people pleasure, anything that brings them more of a feeling of freedom and autonomy. And so when all this happened, it was easy for them to take Timothy Leary's words and Ken Kesey's words and to just roll that up and to exaggerate things and make it look as bad as possible and play on the prejudices that we have in our society against things that heal us.
Can you go into further about what you think it was about the 60s that discouraged the use of this and encouraged government control over them? What was happening in the 60s that made all of this go into effect?
In the 60s, we were in the midst of a very unpopular war. And we had a draft, which meant that people couldn't use, say, bone spurs to get out of the draft. When you're fighting an unpopular war, you look at where are the people who are most against the war and how can you basically stop them. And at the same time in the 60s, there was an explosion of social justice, the civil rights movement, human justice, the environmental movement, the people stopped thinking that subjugating women was a divine plan. So there was a women's movement. There was a lot of social uproar in the United States on very basic issues. And when the young man or woman who comes home from college and says to their father, the banker, all of your values suck. And then the father says, where did you learn that? He says, at school, with my friends. So you begin to see the generational upset in the 60s was quite extreme. And outlawing psychedelics was part of the government response, and just part.
Where was it that both of your fascinations or curiosities with this or experiences with this come into play for eventually writing this book and helping to educate people on the power of microdosing?
Well, I was involved in high dose research from 1961. So
How
I'm kind
high?
of old guard, psychedelic, high dose, transcendence, see God, change your
How
life.
high? How high was the dose?
High was high.
Well, later on, Jim actually has written up his most transcendent experience, and it was published, and we can get you that link. And
Oh,
it's funny and
fascinating.
it's interesting, and so we'll get you
Yeah.
that later.
Oh, I bet. I'm only just curious because I did 5 grams for my sort of biggest dose, which
Well,
I'm betting is still pretty high, but I'm betting your doses are higher.
no,
These high doses.
it's not how much you take. It's how much you're willing to let go of when the push to let go happens.
Of course.
And and at high doses, among the things that people let go of is their personal identity, their connection to their own body, and then at a still higher dose, the question of what's the nature of time? Is there death? All of this is very high dose. What's
Okay.
wonderful about microdosing is none of that appears in any way, shape, or form.
Right. Well, I mean, when they recommend sort of 1 to 3 capsules or basically 1 capsule for microdose, shoot, I've taken half a gram and not felt anything before. So there's definitely not a feeling necessarily for the most part with microdosing. But I can tell you with the 5 grams, a lot of those concepts that you just brought up definitely came into frame.
Oh
I
yes,
mean,
oh yes.
initially in the experience, I literally knew being human wasn't real. I was like, wow, this is not real. And then I was like, oh, my sister's going to be so pissed off at me because she doesn't do any of this stuff. So I was like, my sister's going to be mad at me and because I'm not going to be able to be human anymore. And then for every question, there was an answer nearly simultaneously. So it was as if time obviously didn't have the same sort of time and learning didn't have the same linear nature to it. And then I realized that being human was a break from this overload of information, that in the field, there's so much information. And that when I sat up after an hour and a half or 2 hours, finally for the first time, that's when I was like, oh my God, being a human is a break from this. This is a gift to be able to pause for a minute and experience all these things. Of course, this was all just to be experienced. And so at one point I get really cold and I was like, well, it's not real. And then it was like the mushrooms were like, no, it's fine. It's just for you to feel. Put a blanket on. It's okay. It's like just what you're feeling. And then at one point there was sort of like it almost felt like it was like a vertical tunnel that went up and these entities or energies were like, hey, if you want to be an ascended master, you have to leave your human form behind. Come with us. And then I was like, wait a minute. No, I want to be human. And that's when I started to build back my reality to being human again, which started with agreeing upon the construct of the mind. So
I
I'm
must
sure I'm
say,
telling you many things that you've experienced, but it touched on a lot of the things that you mentioned that had to do with high dose. So
oh, it's you covered it beautifully. Okay, you covered the amazing uh, realization that being human is a small piece.
yeah. Yeah.
And I must say, I love the idea of your seeing it as, oh, hey, we get some time off from universal awareness and just get to play a little. It's a
Yeah.
little bit like when you're a child and you pretend that you can't find your brother.
Oh, yeah, sure. Exactly. You play the game.
So fortunately, you're a brave and open person, and you were able to experience that and bring it back and integrate it. There's a lot of people in the world who that's going to be too much for. And that's where microdosing begins to come in. And to bring us back to your question, after Jim had been in the world of high doses for 45 years, somebody told him about microdosing.
Mm.
And at first, he had no interest whatsoever, nor anyone he knew. But then he started asking questions to people who had tried it and gathering information. And then there were reporters and this thing about coding in Silicon Valley. And it was kind of a positive feedback loop of the signal getting stronger and stronger all the way up to Ayelet Waldman writing her book, A Really Good Day, and Jim being featured in the Michael Pollan interview. I came in around right after Jim learned about it. He told me about it. And at that point, I had a writing practice in downtown Palo Alto in editing and ghostwriting. And I stuck to Jim's protocol or schedule or way of doing microdosing very strictly because I was working and I didn't want to mess up. And we wrote a book in 2015, from 2015 to 2020, called Your Symphony of Selves, SELVES, which is about multiple personality and why it's normal for everybody to have more than one self. And once you understand that, life is a lot easier. And then since Jim had already written the book on microdosing, really, because of his efforts, I mean, he is the modern developer of modern microdosing, not obviously indigenous microdosing, which also goes back, but having written the book on microdosing, it was now time to write the book on microdosing. And that's how we got here.
I'd love to hear a little indigenous background, because obviously that's one of the, I think, positive attributes to these medicines versus so many others, is that and its pathway to legalization again and usage that is not judged, is that it's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. And so, I'm most fascinated with ancient history. I would say more modern history, world wars and whatnot is not nearly as intriguing. But when we track back to the Incans, to Mayans, to the Egyptians, Sumerians, Atlantis, like all of that is very fascinating to me. And in many of those cultures, there's definitely information that seems like it's alluding to plant medicines being a part of their practice. So I'd love to hear, what your research and understanding has been about more of the ancient practices of these medicines and what their uses were.
Any culture that had access to consciousness altering plants or mushrooms used them. And they used them at two levels. They used them on a practical daily level, reduce pain, improve sex, improve hunting. Hunting's a nice one because when you microdose with hunting, your visual acuity is improved. That's terrific for hunting. Your ability to last longer before exhaustion is improved. That's fantastic for hunting. So we see in culture after culture, independently, not surprising, finding the use of plant medicines. And we go back, the prettiest image we have is a 9,000-year-old image of a shaman, and out of his arms and out of his shoulders, mushrooms. So it's a kind of uniform, or kind of, make a great t-shirt for 9,000 years ago. So it's been part of the culture. Now, also in many cultures, they also used a much higher dose, and that were, quote, ritual. And that was much more, as you described, your experience. There's a lot of question about the basics of many religious traditions are an individual having visions. And we know one of the ways to have visions is the use of plant medicines. There are other ways, but this is more available and takes training and so forth. So what we're seeing is modern microdosing, predominantly due to my ignorance of everything I just talked about, emerged without an understanding of the long-term indigenous use. We're now working with indigenous groups, mainly in South America, and basically we're trading awareness and trading ways of use. A group in South America called Microdosing, based in Peru, for instance, uses microdosing. How do they make the microdose? Well, they have Shipibo shamans who are part of their team, and they make the medicine.
Yep, that's right. There's two families in the Amazon, and one is the Shipibo. That's who did my ayahuasca ceremony. Hiked Machu Picchu and took Wachuma, and the shaman was describing how they'd sort of go about life in their culture, and that if kids kind of got a little bit too far Western and started to want certain things that weren't healthy, whether it be technology or whatnot, they would give them some plant medicine. And they would kind of bring them back in line again, and even in the ayahuasca experience with the Shipibo family, it was a husband and wife and a son, and there was many kids in the family. Just the son came, and they all three took it during the ceremony. And on the second night, the son, I think he was 15 maybe or something. I mean, he I'm going to say it appropriately for the medicine ceremony. He purged all night, all night. Like, I was like, wow, you'd think he'd get it all out of him with doing all these ceremonies. So, that is definitely part of traditions in other cultures right now. But of course, I'm sure even in the past, it was a huge part of their religion, essentially.
Well, they were part of how they understood the way the universe was put together. And one of the ways you do that is become part of the kind of physical being of the deity, so
Right.
that you clearly feel that you understand that you're part of God. And then as you look around, you see that everyone else that you're taking the medicine with is part of God. And then you begin to realize so
Hmm.
is the floor.
Hmm.
You begin to realize that there's a whole nother way of looking at reality from the position of unity. And it then subdivides, but only at a kind of on the level of illusion. So in your major breakthrough, and when you said, "Oh, I'm no longer human," the answer is most of you has never been human, and the part of you that's human is doing fine, and that's the way the universe is built up. If you think about it, this is a hand. It's got all kinds of structures, but it's also just a lot of molecules. And
Yeah.
actually, all those molecules are just atoms.
Yeah.
And I have a shirt on which is also just atoms.
Hmm.
But as the atoms coalesce, they go in different directions. So the high dose realization makes sense when you begin to look at the great religions, which
Mm.
suggests that we're all part of divinity. When you get down to the practical uses, my shirt and my body really have very different lifestyles.
I hope so.
And hopefully, my body has a kind of longer life span and so forth. And so, when we get down to being practical, then the usual questions come up is how can I make this life in this body, in this time zone work better? And
Mm.
that's when therapies and practices and breathing and what we're seeing is that microdosing fits into the general rubric of things that generally improve the functioning of the human body.
In my circles, it's like, oh, was the burning bush really a sober experience by Moses? Or was that actually, because isn't it the acacia tree? And isn't the acacia tree part of ayahuasca?
Well, yeah.
Or think about Terence McKenna pointing out that mushrooms are caprophilic. They love dung. And what did the Israeli tribes have when they were wandering? And then they would eat this stuff called manna. And that they'd see it as anything and taste it as anything. Very interesting.
Well, and
So
there's also the stoned ape theory, which is that back in the day they just ate copious amounts of psychedelic mushrooms, and it essentially evolved their brain to be more modern human brains as we experience today with more capabilities.
it's certainly one of the theories, and I'm a little shy on theories because there's another definition of the word theory. It's called guess,
I love guessing. It's
and
fun.
I
You
love
can
guessing too.
philosophize.
I'll settle for actual real experiences and real reports. So you didn't your description of your session, your time, was a human experience. It was real world evidence. I totally understood it and appreciated it. If you'd said, it's possible that I could have laid on a bed and I could have had all these possible things and I could have worried about my sister, that's juicy, kind of less real.
Mm.
It's kind of like I'm gonna drive a car, but only pretend.
It's like I went out in that Indy 500 and I was beating you. I was leading the race. It's like,
Exactly. You've
mm,
got it.
Yeah. In another branch of the multiverse, I beat your ass.
exactly. I'm sure there's been quite a few very important transcendental experiences, life transformative experiences, but I'd love for you both to share what comes to mind first, the most impactful plant medicine experience that you've had that showed you more.
October 19th, 1961. I'm in my first 6 or 8 weeks of being a graduate student in psychology, predominantly because you didn't go to Vietnam if you were in graduate school.
Mm.
So I was not exactly an enthusiastic student. And I had pretty much everything that you've already talked about, which is the realization that Jim Fadiman, for whatever good or bad he is a small part of who I actually am.
Hmm.
When I had that and I looked about the room where I had two guys, a man and a woman, and I thought, does anyone else ever had this experience? Am I really special? And I looked at them and I said a couple of words, and my relief was, no, they know exactly what I'm going through. That's why they invited me to do this.
Mm.
Now, the problem was I was still a graduate student in a very rigid psychology program. And if I stepped out of line, they were free to let me go, and my draft board was free to pick me up. So I developed the capacity of separating into good graduate student, and then at night reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the and other basic religious texts to begin to understand what had happened to me, and that it wasn't unique, and it was part of the human experience.
Wow.
And so that one day shifted my basic orientation of not only who I was, but who everything was.
For me, in my early 20s, I became a pagan or neo-pagan, joined something called the Church of All Worlds. But I went to a festival and took a high dose of mushrooms, and the priestess was sky-clad, as they say. She was a woman from the Northeast. And as the moon arose, I felt the goddess. Like, I experienced the uplifting of Gaia and knew for certainty, and still know, despite my, going to synagogue sometimes and being in that world, but I experienced the absolute reality of that. And I had also met a guy named Bill Eichmann, who was sort of a cross between Gurdjieff and Crowley, and did many high dose sessions with him with that, where, the things that happened are sort of beyond description. And one quick one is that we were both sitting with our eyes closed, and I saw myself in a room with this kind of an angle, like in Batman, the old criminal layers are always on an angle. And I saw this set of levers and things across the room, and I walked over to it, and it was golden and shimmering. And I was about to pull it. My eyes are closed, his eyes are closed, and he says to me across the room, I know you think you'll get immortality if you pull that lever, but it will probably kill you. I wouldn't do that. And so being with him, he's gone now a few years, but he was the most brilliant magician I've ever known. And so I had a lot of training, just being with him as friends,
I find it so interesting how absolutely etched in stone these experiences are in this state. Anyone that I've ever had in that altered state is like etched in stone in my mind. I can't forget it. It's so vivid still, no matter how long ago it was. And I think you said 1961, and you're recalling the day.
Well,
verbatim.
absolutely.
So why is that the case?
Because you discover that the world is a far different place, far richer, far more intricate, and that you're part of it. And this is a word that we throw around, but it comes out of most people's very high doses. It feels like the energy of the universe is more like love than any other energy.
Yeah.
And that keeps you aware, whatever else you're doing, that kind of behind the set, there is this larger force. And you also, for most people, and one of the ways I kind of check with people, I said, were you ever born and do you die? And if they kind of look at me like, what a silly question, I understand they've had an experience similar to what many of us have had, which is this thing, this body, this little package is not going to last, but something lasts. Not Jim Fadiman. He's had a good run, but there is something that lasts. And if we think about it, if we go back to the atoms, they don't go away. They just recombine in new forms.
I love the movie Lucy. The movie Lucy at the end when she gets 100% use of her brain. But as she's on the way, she's like, she's got the hand that just keeps changing form. She's like, it could be anything, this, that, and it's just like such a great visual depiction of how, you just reorganize atoms into a new way. And it's our mind that builds the construct.
So another answer to your question might be that when you're on those intense experiences, you're at max neuroplasticity. Keep in mind there are neurons throughout the whole body, not just the brain, and that neurons actually communicate with each other in more ways than we normally talk about. They do radio waves, they do packets, and And when that's happening and you have that big of I think it's literally an imprint of your most exceptional experience is somehow recorded in your memory, wherever that is.
I want to talk about that quite a bit because I'm guessing this has a lot to do with with the effect of microdosing and the effect of high dosing or any dosing is neuroplasticity. But I always thought about neuroplasticity in a way that sort of like it created the neurons, but essentially like it's the work after. But maybe it is in that moment that there's so much new neurological activity, neuroplasticity happening.
And
the
they
neurons
change
firing.
shape and they change form and they do crazy things when you're on high doses.
The whole idea of neuroplasticity is not even that new, to be honest, it seems like, but it's so powerful. And just understanding even down to the fact that our genetics matter somewhat, but it's our epigenetics and it's our neuroplasticity that we can implement throughout our life that can really create the personality or change the personality and change patterns and traumas and all kinds of things. So
it gives you the opportunity to do that. It gives you the opportunity, to have neurons and populations of neurons connect differently and to also let go of things you don't want. So you have that opportunity, you have that window. And, Andrew Huberman has an analogy. I keep mentioning him, so eventually he'll invite us on his podcast, where when you take a big dose psychedelic, it's like you're taking a big lever and you've uprooted a boulder that is neuroplasticity that then goes through the village of your mind. And you have to know how to direct it. Maybe you can plow something, but you don't want to knock down that building. When you're doing microdosing, it's much smaller levers and much smaller rocks of neuroplasticity. But because you're doing it, let's say every third day on the Fadiman protocol for 7 or 8 weeks, you develop a certain kind of momentum and you're aware that you can put things together or that you have more focus and that you can perform better or that you can feel better about who you're being and get back into a sense of who you really like being you. So all of that is available when you're microdosing, and it's a lot easier to take in than when you're on high doses because that's just inherently overwhelming.
There can be monumental shifts in the macro dose, in the big doses that are life changing, like the next day, I'm sure. Yes, but with the microdosing. So explain more about neuroplasticity. What is actually happening, and how do you use it after? Because something that plant medicine usually has a great emphasis on is integration. But with microdosing in particular, there's not necessarily a prophetic experience or something that you reflect on. I mean, it could be, I'm sure, but you're not having you're not really feeling
changing
as much.
your view of reality.
Right. So please
You're
explain
still you.
how neuroplasticity works and how the mushrooms or the LSD or whatever substance works that creates this neuroplasticity.
Well, imagine if you were told, if you go to the gym and you work out, you're going to get a better body, but you only can go for one day. And you got to work your ass off every moment of that day because that's it. And you actually can't come back to the gym, no matter how much you want, for quite a while. And someone else says, that's nuts. That's not the way the body works. The insight is the gym is really a helpful place. But if you go a couple of times a week and you get you're told what is good to work on and what needs help, and you begin to understand your own body better, and you see the gradual changes, at some point you say, oh, I don't really need to go to the gym this often, or maybe I should come. You're in control of your own internal changes. The thing about high doses is you don't have control. You basically, it's kind of, if you ever go surfing, you don't control the wave. No matter how smart you are and how good a surfer you are, the wave actually does 98% of the work. And so what we're seeing in microdoses is a way to keep, to not disturb you, to not upset you. People who take microdosing for depression, they don't have great insights. They don't have great breakthroughs. They just stop being depressed. They say, that's fine. That's enough.
Right. That's the goal anyway.
Exactly. That's the only real goal.
Another way to think about this is one thing we know that psychedelics do is they turn down the default mode network, which is your kind of ordinary sense of self when you're not thinking about anything. That's just kind of who you are and what you're doing. And so when you have psychedelics, whether
is that the prefrontal cortex that shuts down, sort of the executive function, like how you normally do?
The default mode network is in a few different places. I think it's the parietal lobe and it's a couple of other places. But so that's toned down, and that means that like it's not as rigid. So as I said, we wrote another book about multiple selves. So you might have a different part of you that is happier or that is really good for working out or is really good for painting or whatever. And you can like more easily get into that part because the normal part of you that's stuck isn't so stuck. Another way to think about it is entropy. There's more entropy in the system when you're on psychedelics. And even with microdoses, there's more sort of energy and you can move it around and you can kind of, but when you're taking the high dose, it's a lot of entropy all at once and has both benefits and you've got to deal with that.
That makes sense. I mean, it dismantles reality to some degree, which is like very much like entropy, like, oh, that's not real. Being human's not real. It sort of breaks things down.
You have basins of attraction in complexity theory. And so your ego and who you are normally falls into one. Like you're in a slightly different one and we're a slightly different one because we're in a professional forward-facing interview. One with our friends, we're a little bit different. But there are ones that you kind of fall into, like a marble. It's going to be at this basin or this basin or this basin. When you're on psychedelics, you know, you're a little bit more out there and you might find yourself going into different basins of attraction more around the perimeter.
But we want to make it clear that microdosing is not little tiny high doses. It's just not. People feel better, but they're still themselves. They still can drive and, as it says on medicine, operate heavy machinery. A wonderful young man years ago stood up in a group and said, I only microdose when I have a coding problem. Which what he was saying is that he was himself, intellectually excited by coding and making a living. But there were places where he would feel stuck. And this, in a sense, oiled that place. He didn't have a revelation of how to create the world's greatest computer. And 2 hours later, he realized he'd forgotten about it.
And
very different.
And the way we've defined things is that if you're having any psychedelic visuals, any major changes in ordinary consciousness, about having your ordinary day, anybody else knows if you've done any of that, you're a little bit too high. And we make this point because people who have health conditions that they really want to address, they need to be very conservative when they start. Because it's fun to mini dose. Believe me, I struggle with not mini dosing too much. But that's not
if I don't feel it, I'm like, oh, damn it.
Yeah, right. That's the issue.
Exactly.
Now, also, there's this really funny cartoon, and we weren't able to get it for the book, but it's something like Greg microdoses and sees God's elbow. And you see God above the clouds, and then you just see his elbow sticking out, and there's one piece of this, brilliant, glowing elbow, and that's what he sees. So a microdose isn't like that. You're not part of you. It's not like a tiny part of you is very high and tripping. It's not like that.
What is it that's making it effective if you can't necessarily see something or experience something? I know you said neuroplasticity, but either there's something else or there's more explanation to exactly what's happening within that.
Remember,
aspect.
neuroplasticity mainly is talking about the brain. If we talk about anti-inflammatory, which is behind most diseases, if your inflammation goes down, one of the first symptoms is you feel better. And if you feel better, you're less likely to be grouchy. You're less likely to bite your kid's head off. You're less likely to get in trouble at work. And you're physically feeling better. You also notice, and you don't do this consciously, that you're starting to eat better. This is one of the first wonderful discoveries people would microdose, say, to get better grades. But then at the end of 30 days, we say, look back and see, is there anything else other than what you intended? And we get these great letters that say, wow, I'm sleeping better. I'm eating more healthy. I went back to my meditation practice. And what we're seeing is the system is now healthier.
Yeah.
And then they say, which is fascinating, I'm using less cannabis, less alcohol, less coffee. And then I thought, well, wait a moment, those are very different places in the brain and so forth and so on. What do they have in common? What they have in common is you reach for them when you're not feeling okay in the mental state you're in. You wake up tired, oh man, coffee's going to go. If I don't wake up tired, do I need coffee? Okay. So what you're getting is a healthier system.
I love coffee.
And that opens up a whole nother set of doors. It opens up the physical body. And one of the things that is most amazing to us about microdosing, and me for all my decades in high doses, is we really didn't look at the body much. But when people say, oh, since I've been microdosing, my migraines, which I've had for 20 years, are 90% gone. Wow. People find literally a restoration of physical agility that they thought they'd lost.
Well, I mean, I had a friend years ago had cancer and he was feeling horrible one night and he came over and the plan was to take some mushrooms that night and it was like he finally felt a little bit better, not all the way. He came over and still wanted to do it. I'm like, gosh, you're a baller. And he felt amazing the next day. He's like, I don't know. I literally think mushrooms are like are just medicine for the body in so many different ways. So you mentioned inflammation, and inflammation is a huge cause of so many diseases, maybe all. So are you saying that you believe that mushrooms also help reduce inflammation in the body?
Oh yeah, we know for
No, we
certain.
don't believe it.
We know it.
We
Okay.
only have evidence.
So here's the thing. The classic psychedelics are well known and well established to have anti-inflammatory effects. It has to do with the brain chemistry. So you've got the anti-inflammatory effects, you've got the neuroplasticity effects,
Yeah.
and then they tend to bring people back into a sense of equilibrium or homeostasis. So all this is going on when you're microdosing and sometimes when you're macrodosing. And as a result, that's why we found it can help so many things.
Let me just give you kind of a little lore from the old high dose early days when we really were giving people transcendent experiences. And I was sitting with an awful lot of people for a few years. And one of the things we noticed is people early on would take their glasses off. Also, we noticed if they had an allergy or cold, it would go away. And at the end of the day, we would actually calibrate when a person was coming down when they reached for their glasses.
You know what the weird one was for me?
Right.
Bug bites.
Got
If
it.
I'm outside, the bugs stop biting me. As soon as I start to come off, the bugs I'm mosquito bites again. It's wild.
Wow.
Yeah. So what we're seeing is, but in those big high dose days, you kind of ignore such interesting things as your physical symptoms go away. So when we're microdosing, we're looking much more carefully at what happens to the whole system. And what we know is that when you're feeling better, whatever that means, it actually means that all the systems of your body have the opportunity to feel better. And that is a shift that is basically more useful. It's wonderful to know that you're a divine being and part of divinity and that the world is made of love. And you have to do your taxes. And if you can do your taxes and not get upset, that's a benefit which is very, very mundane and necessary. Okay. Well, you'll give it a try this year because who knows?
Death by taxes. It's true. You mentioned food and you said it makes you help make healthier choices. However, I found that it makes you want to not want food at all. So like generally speaking, food is not cohesive with it. It reduces slows down the absorption even when you take it. And then when you're on it, you don't really want food. And so, anybody that's done any kind of journeying.
That's all high dose.
Yeah. That's all high.
Okay.
You're
That's
right.
kind of like high dose, like
right.
high dose cannabis is the munchies. Okay.
Remember, on microdosing, you're having your regular day. Most of the time you forget you're even actually microdosing.
Right.
You might be a little bit aware you're on a little bit of something, but it's not front and center. You're doing it at this subtle level. We like to say less is enough. We used to say less is more. Now we're just saying less is enough.
That's great.
And that's where the miracles happen.
Now, let me just give you kind of the example because I live on examples of real people.
I mean, that's what the book is all about, is like
Exactly.
really life examples of what people have experienced.
And then one of the stories in the book is a guy I was working with early on, and he was a compulsive gambler and had a few other issues, and he was overdosing with cannabis. Social sex life wasn't very good. And so he started microdosing and things started to clear up. And he also was a junk food addict. And at one point, I get this wonderful note. He said, I went to a restaurant with my kids and my girlfriend, and I looked at the menu, and by God, I wanted a salad.
Yeah.
That was like a breakthrough for him that his body said, now that you're working on yourself, 99% of your cells would like a little better treatment. And that's what we're seeing. It's these See, well, if you're a researcher, you try and eliminate all the variables possible. So there's
Sure.
like one little thing you're looking at. So if we look at, say, the studies on depression and high doses, yay, depression goes away for a while. Nobody looks at all the other changes that we see in the reports we get from people who say, you know, I microdosed depression and I cleaned up my room and I washed all the pots in the kitchen and I felt so much better. And then I went out in the park and now I take a walk every day. None of that comes up in the depression studies because they say, here's a scale. You were an 8 when you entered. How do you feel now? Well, I'm a 2. Well, great. It's changed depression. That's wonderful. But we're really seeing you can't isolate parts of human beings in reality. You can in science. But what we're looking at is why is it that people's whole physical being seems to improve? And here's the we used to say it's not a pharmaceutical, and there's lots of reasons it doesn't act like a pharmaceutical. But you say, well, is there anything that's good for everything? I say, how about exercise? Well, that's good for everything. How about sleep? Well, that's good for everything. How about improving your diet? Well, that's good for everything. Well, maybe microdoses, which affect all the cells of the body and seem to give them a better break.
Yeah.
It may not be the brain itself.
Yeah.
It may be the mitochondria, which is in every cell.
I was just going to ask about that. I was just going to ask if there's been any studies on the effect of these substances on the mitochondrial function.
Not a lot, not yet.
Not yet.
We're kind of at the edges of that, but
Yeah,
I feel like this is such a field where it's looking for funding. Like there's just like, it's a field that needs research, needs funding, needs, you know, people to really get behind it with, you know, real capabilities to do everything all with a way to double-blind studies and whatnot, so that things are actually true again.
Science actually works.
Yeah.
First, with individual real life experiences. Somebody thinks about or discovers or imagines the possibility of something.
Yeah.
Then when there's a little more evidence, they say, I could do a study because that's what I know how to do. And then they say, well, would anybody fund it? And I say, well, now that I have a couple of my friends who've had the same experience, I can justify doing the science. Because science, whether we like it or not, is actually based not on higher levels of truth, but on levels of funding. And the nice thing about the way we've been working with microdoses, we say to people, let us know what you've experienced in your normal life, not in a laboratory, because if it's only true in a laboratory, it's of no interest.
Huh, interesting. I mean, these are effects, right? Like they advertise the side effects, but they really actually are just all effects.
exactly.
Right. There's only effects. There's no side effects. That's the smartest bit of marketing that the pharmaceutical people have ever come up with.
Oh, you won't really notice the blindness. Don't worry.
I have a question for you. So, you know, the book is about enhanced health and healing, but it's also about enhanced performance. That's in things like writing and creativity and art, but it's also in volleyball and jujitsu. And we heard from Ben Greenfield, who's a well-known nutritionist and exercise guru, that in long distance ultra marathon runners, the word is out, and there are definitely people taking advantage of it for
LSD, right?
Well, probably yes. So I'm wondering about, you know, the world of race car driving. Have you heard? Have you heard anything?
It's illegal. All drugs are illegal. You get drug tested. And now I never went too far down into like who, how, where, what, when does it clear your system? I just never did anything while I raced. So my only exposure into any kind of drugs at all was after I was done with my career. So no, there isn't any known, there's no research on that. And I would bet there's nobody doing it.
There are no tests, by the way.
There are no tests.
Yeah, which is why a lot of sports are now.
There's no test, like, so the drug testing does not cover psilocybin, LSD.
Correct.
It could, but it doesn't.
It could, but it doesn't.
Interesting. Have you looked into that with like the
with
organization?
Professional athletes?
Yeah,
with professional athletes, and they say, of course, I'm going to do whatever I can to help my body work well. And I also know that if I take a little too much of a psychedelic, I'm driving and all of a sudden there's Godzilla. Okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't work. they understand that their mind has to be
Yeah.
at its sharpest,
Yeah.
not at its biggest.
It's true.
That's why we see it in sports, and we see it also in basically endurance sports. It's the most obvious. That's why
Yeah.
the long
I mean, the
distance
first,
marathoners.
yeah, that makes sense. I haven't necessarily experienced it. Actually, that's not true. There was one it was like a adaptogen blended performance psilocybin microdose, and I took it a few times before I worked out, and I don't know, all those days I was very strong.
I don't
And
know.
I know that there are also adaptogens. Like, I mean, we're called one a drug and one not a drug, one illegal, one legal. But look, they all have effects, right? So, I know that cordyceps is a really powerful one for endurance performance. I took cordyceps before I ran the Boston Marathon. Like, anyway, I know cordyceps is probably part of this blended psilocybin microdose. But have you guys dabbled in the adaptogen world, blending, mixing, creating
Well,
compounds like that, or
and
blending?
we're actually observers. Okay,
Mm.
we're the people that sit on the sidelines and we watch you do stuff. We then say to you, why, how did you do anything different? They say, well, yeah, I was taking a microdose. We say, what was the difference that you saw? I mean, let me give you just a straight example. This is a guy in his early 40s, loves running, basically runs every day and keeps really good records. And he writes me and he says, I notice on days when I microdose, um, my time is better and I feel better and it's a nice thing. And I said, that's terrific. And then he writes and says, I'm going to actually, I don't race often, but I have a half marathon coming up. Why don't I microdose during the half marathon? I'll let you know. And I say, fine. See, that's science. That's real people science. We're going to measure something and everyone gets very excited. Okay. So I wait and comes this note. He said, wow, man. He said, there's a half marathon. I took 20 minutes off my time.
Oh my God.
And then he said, because this is an amateur
You gotta
run.
quiet down. You can't say that too loud because they will start testing for it then.
Okay, so, well, we think that will happen. But what he then said is, that's the best time I've had in 10 years. His awareness was unchanged, if maybe a little better. But what his body was, it was able to just work more effectively. Now, I don't know all the rules about drugs, but are you allowed to have coffee before a race?
Yeah.
Oh, why would
Someone
you
decided
do
that one was legal. I agree. I mean, I remember watching a program like 15 years ago, maybe longer, and it was something about on like what drugs were legalized and what was made illegal and where it ranked in the schedule of drugs. And on the docket at the same level was like coffee and cocaine. And they were like, one they picked was legal and one was illegal. It's like, humans made these decisions about, what is what, it didn't fall into some like super scientific program, it seems like, where it went through a machine and was spat out data that made it fall into one category or another. These are human beings making decisions about what they think is right and wrong for culture.
And that's where we are. And so if we have a position, a kind of moral position, is that people should be allowed to make themselves more healthy. And there are some countries where it's built into the Constitution that you can't prevent someone from doing something that improves their health. The US is not one of those countries.
And I would say also that I have quite a few friends who are blending and mixing things all the time. It's not just the Stamets stack, which is well known, but people are trying a little bits of this and that, and more or less of this and that. And I love to microdose and work out. It's just you're stronger. There's no question.
Yeah. Before we move on to like just like the microdosing protocol and just the substances used and whatnot, I'm curious about a couple of substances. One is I didn't see MDMA in the book. Is that not one of them that is recommended for any kind of microdose?
The reason you didn't see MDMA is that it doesn't seem to be useful for microdosing.
Okay.
It's just very simply.
We had to make some distinctions, and we had 3 categories: things that are used for microdosing, things that people sort of say they're microdosing with, but not really, and things we're not recommending. And so MDMA is in the not recommended, just as DMT. It's not going to work. Cannabis, people say they are, but it really doesn't work because it has a whole different neuroplasticity profile.
Mm.
So up there in the beginning, in the basic section, there's this whole list, and we may have to change that a little bit. And we're learning new things from people. Ibogaine, there are
Humans
people
making decisions, right?
Somebody has to make a decision
Yeah,
and put it out there,
exactly.
and you get feedback.
Yeah, so we
Right.
basically, again, we're limited by what people have actually experienced. We don't tell people to do stuff. So 95% of the reports in the book are psilocybin. That's just what we're reporting on.
The other substance was cannabis, and I found it fascinating to see that it actually had the opposite effect on neuroplasticity.
No, I'm really happy I didn't start using cannabis till I was 17. I don't think I would be as smart as I am, literally, if I had started when I was 14. We know it has a negative effect. Now, if you're using really old style cannabis that's high in CBDs and CBNs, it can spark creativity, and it might have a little bit of neuroplasticity profile.
Mm.
But also, people don't use cannabis. They don't take a small bit and come back 2 or 3 days later. Nobody uses it the way we use microdosing. So people will talk about it, but
It's kind of like falls under that category, like you said, of caffeine, alcohol, and cannabis, where you're like looking, they're like mood fixers.
Right.
Like you're tired, you need to pick me up. You're stressed, you take this. You're, annoyed, you're anxious, you take that. It's like they really do. That's a really great distinction between, the substances you're referring to and those three.
yeah, we have a friend named Wendy who's made the point to me many times that if you're smoking a lot of cannabis, you're just masking the way your body's working and the way your digestive system is working. And, you got to look at it's not what you want to be doing, probably.
What do you think about people who take cannabis at night for sleep?
If it helps them sleep,
Yeah, why not?
we know that most prescribed sleeping medicines have a negative effect on health.
Oh, like synthetics, like Ambien or
Like
something
Ambien.
like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that literally recent research out of England talks about how many years off your life you are likely to experience if you consistently use, say, sleep meds like Ambien.
Mm.
So again, the thing that when we say less is enough, the assumption that we have is what's the least amount of a powerful substance you can take for maximum benefit.
Mm-hmm.
If you take less than that, you will not have the benefits. And if you take more than that, you will not have the benefits. So each individual needs to work out what's best for them. Again, it's similar. Again, when you go to the gym, you have a trainer, you have a coach, but fundamentally, you have to say, wait a moment, coach, when I do that, this old injury suddenly hurts. And their coach, if they're reasonable, says, well, don't do that. So fundamentally, we still are the final arbiter of what goes in and out of our body.
And one other thing to say about cannabis that's really important for everyone listening to this is that because of economic pressures, the THC levels in cannabis is now sky high, unlike anything that anyone's ever experienced. And all of the other things, the CBNs, the CBDs, are much lower. So we are now seeing cannabis withdrawal syndromes, and there's a literature about psychotic episodes resulting from it. So today's cannabis with this 35% THC and nothing else, it's not the same. It's not plant medicine in the same way because of this hyper focus on only THC because of economic reasons.
When I was,
What did it used to be? I'm curious. I mean, I've always heard that, and
10,
cannabis
11,
is not my jam. So but
Right.
what did it used to be? 8?
8, 10. It was much, much lower. They boosted it to 30 plus, but that comes at a cost. It's like monocropping the chemicals within the substance itself.
now, just remember the United States moved from being beer and cider and wine to high potency alcohol. When did that occur? Big surprise during Prohibition. Then when I was living in Europe at one point, and someone said to me, why do Americans always get drunk at a party?
Because it's 16.5% wine instead of 12.
Well, because they have grown up in a culture of high alcohol, high density alcohol, so to speak. And they haven't learned, as Europeans do, to drink kind of as a social event, not as the necessity of how drunk can you get and how fast. So we see that in cannabis. We see that the way we kind of protect ourselves in the microdose world is if you're getting a little bit high, that just says that's too much. It won't work for you. And we actually now have some wonderful hard science data on brainwaves that say a certain amount of cognitive improvement at a low microdose. If you go a little bit above that, that cognitive advantage goes away.
Neural complexity.
Wow.
Neurocomplexity.
Say more. I want to hear
And
more.
there's and if we make that back into English, if you take a little bit too much, you're getting a little bit too high, you lose focus. You may be very cheerful and very happy, but that isn't the reason you were taking it.
It's just like the difference between a microdose and a mini dose. If you mini dose every day or every third day, even if you stick to the protocol, it stops working. You get distracted, you get defocused, you get tired. More is actually less. And that's really hard for us to understand and believe in.
Well, we're such meaning-making machines as human beings. We feel like there needs to be, if you can't see it, you need to feel it. And, if it's not there, then it's not doing anything.
And just the mores. If some is good, more is better. And you want more, like a 4-year-old.
If we take another little grouping and not, and imagine that microdoses are much more similar to a vitamin. If you say to someone,
one day it will be. One day that's exactly what it will be, because that's really what it is.
If you say to someone, "Are you taking vitamin D?" and they say, "Yeah, I take 2,000 a day, 2,000 micrograms a day," and you say, "How's it feel?" They say, "What are you talking about? It doesn't feel like anything." What if you don't take? Well, I don't know.
Yeah,
but right. I do know, because my doctor and I talk about it. It saves my life. And so that's the right amount. The right amount is not changing your awareness. The right amount is improving your awareness, improving your capacity, improving your strength, improving your blood flow, improving the mitochondria energetically affecting all cells. So it's in its own category, but it's the same category as sleep and exercise, and that's very understandable.
And this analogy to a vitamin also brings up the question of, do you need to do intention? Do you need journaling? Do you need to do integration? Do you need to work with a coach or a therapist? And the answer is, if you believe you need to, then it will work better. But if you're not someone who's interested in that stuff, we've given you pretty much everything you need to know in the book.
That's very in line with also plant medicine mentality, is like, just sort of like, if you think you need it, you need it. If you don't, it's like, it's very pure, essentially. I'm curious if there are any studies planned, or if there are any studies that are happening or have come out that have been able to measure any kind of biological markers over the course of a microdose protocol that someone has done. Is there anything in the works or anything that's happened to be able to measure any kind of biomarkers?
Oh, there's a lot of science starting up, because there are a lot of people microdosing, and many of them are research scientists. So that's how it really works in the real world. And so just as your interests in the physical world relate back to your own physical skills and your when you were at your maximum physical capacity, because you needed to be for not only to win races, but not to hurt yourself. Okay. So half of the research studies that are in the book were done in the last year and a half while we were writing the book. So originally we said, as is said in many places, there's very little research about microdosing. By the time we finished the book, area after area was showing up. And it's showing up because individuals would say, whoa, I mean, somebody takes it for their incredibly painful, difficult, psychologically damaging period. So they know it's going to happen again in a couple of weeks. And they find in microdosing that they actually don't attack their children and are mad at their husband, and their sex isn't lousy, and they feel that they can get things done. They then know someone who's interested in that. And that's how science actually works. So we're seeing those biomarkers. We're much more aware of people who simply report. See, one of the biomarkers for depression is, it turns out this is the only measurement that is really valid. Are you depressed? Okay. And if the answer is yes, that's called depressed. If the answer is no, then you're not depressed.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
when we have a few hundred people who go from yes, I'm depressed to no, I'm not depressed,
Biomarker.
that's a biomarker.
Yeah, you're right.
And also, one of the ways we know it's not just a placebo, which is something that people say, is that there are a variety of different measurements, blood flow scans, brain scans, BDNF markers, and all of these show a very similar signal, but at a lower amplitude to high doses. So it's, we know that something is really going on. And again, when you're doing it, every second or third day over several weeks, a certain kind of momentum builds up. And because of the anti-inflammatory effects, you're feeling better. Because of the neuroplasticity, you're better able to get back into that part of you that loves to do what you love to do most. And it just feels like it builds on itself over time.
Please describe to everyone what the protocol is.
So a protocol is a fancy word for schedule, and sometimes also includes the idea of what the dosage is. The most well-known protocol is named the Fadiman protocol. Jim made it up, but he had good reasons for doing so. And on that, you take the substance on day 1, and then on day 2, you're off. And then on day 3, you're off. And then you're back on day 4. And you do that for 6 to 8 weeks, and then you take 2, maybe 3 weeks off after you've done that. So that's the basic schedule. Paul Stamets has different schedules, including one where you're on for 4 days, and then you're off for 3 days. If you're doing that, you're actually taking a dose 19 times in a 31-day month. On Jim's, you're taking 11 times. We like to recommend Jim's because it is more conservative. It's easier to stick with. It gives you more time to integrate things. And you also have this really fascinating thing called the second day effect.
So that was one of the early discoveries, which is I'm living in Santa Cruz, California, and there's no lack of people interested in psychedelics. And I say to people, would you like to just try this very, very, very super low dose? And they'll look at me like, well, sure. And they say, wow, I feel pretty good all day. And then they say, wow, I feel pretty good the second day. That's really interesting. So that was one of our first discoveries, that taking it every day can be done. It wastes material. We're always feeling less is enough. And it also suggests that the substance has left your body already. So what you're feeling better about is how your body is reacting to itself. And that's, after all, the goal of every intervention is to get the body to take over.
And there's even research that shows that on the second day, people are sleeping substantially better.
That's fantastic. So the substance has left the body, but the reduced inflammation, the increased homeostasis is what remains. The neuroplasticity, all of that remains.
Right, and you learn how to use it. So over time, most of the people I know, including myself, are using less of the same substance. It's kind of like you already know how to get there. You already know how to get your brain in gear and your body in gear without quite as much. And it's even at the microdosing level. This is my favorite statistic, forgive me, but 1 microgram of LSD, and keep in mind, typical dose is between 7 and 12 for beginners. 1 microgram has 1.54 quadrillion molecules of LSD in it. That's a lot. Your body only has 30 or 40 trillion cells, and not all of them by any means are capable of interacting with psychedelics. So even at these low levels, and we find on Reddit and other places, people sometimes take 1 or 2 orders of magnitude less than they're supposed to, and they're still getting really positive results. So that's why we keep saying less is enough. If less works for you, if you're not really just wanting to be higher and higher, then why not stick with the less?
Exactly. I agree. Of course, everybody likes the little bit higher and higher every now and again. How do you determine whether or not someone uses psilocybin, LSD? I know there's more than that, but those are the primary, correct?
Well, the usual, again, we're dealing with the real world. The first question is,
What they can get.
What can you get? That's the basic question. And there's been a shift. More and more and more it's psilocybin, because mushrooms grow everywhere. There's 200 species that include psilocybin. There are now grow kits, so people literally grow at home with quite high success. And so what we're seeing is what people tell us. The hard science between LSD and psilocybin. I love these studies. There's one huge study of every physiological measure that they could afford to do. And they discovered, hold your breath, psilocybin lasts not as long as LSD.
Right.
It's kind of like
I mean, it's a
discovering that
lot less. Like, I mean,
yellow
I feel
doesn't
like LSD is like 10 hours sometimes, right? If you take a
Oh,
full dose. I'm just
That's
talking
right.
about, because I don't know, I'm the microdosing world is not my jam, but at least from the full dose world, it's like 10 hours for LSD and like 4 or 5 for
Hard
mushroom.
science discovered that on their own, only,
Right.
1,000 years after everybody else. Okay. But that's just physical. There's another great study where they measured every psychological variable, again, that they could fit in. And they discovered that LSD lasts longer than psilocybin. Okay. So that's the hard science, which is there's no difference. Okay. The soft science, which is the hundreds of thousands of people who use these materials and have over decades, they're very clear that psilocybin is a better choice if the reason you're taking it, this is microdosing, has something to do with feelings and relationships and part of kind of the living system that we're a part of.
Okay.
For more intellectual questions, for discovery, for writing, for philosophical, rumination, for understanding in general, LSD is preferred. Now, again, we're not talking about huge differences. Both are good for both. And when we look at say something like ADHD, we have not yet found any differences between people who use LSD or psilocybin. They both have the same basic levels of improvement.
so another way to put this is that LSD is a non-specific amplifier. You can use it to focus on whatever the heck you want. Psilocybin will actually want to heal you and teach you and help you evolve. It seems as more of that entity is involved with it.
Do you guys have a lot of any anecdotal research, any research, any biological research on the effects of microdosing ayahuasca? I know that's in the book. I don't know if
Oh
it's
no,
most common
there
to
is.
find, but
This is wonderful. This is the microwaska people.
yeah,
Now,
You said
you know why they
microwaska.
call themselves, and they work with microdoses of
Mhm.
either ayahuasca or, depending if it's not legal in a given country, they're throughout South America, just the Banisteriopsis capi or the vine. Okay. And they work with the same. When I
Thought it
read
didn't
over
work
there,
without the leaf.
well, you'll see why in a moment. Okay. And this comes from a very reputable source. Okay. Real science, which is they basically use it pretty much the way people are using psilocybin or LSD. Okay. But what happens? So they went to the shamans and they said, here people in this country want to use our preparation, our microdose of ayahuasca, but it's illegal. And the shaman said, I'm going to tell you a little secret. The healing is in the Banisteriopsis capi. And you say, well, what about the DMT plant, of which there are many different ones used across South America? They say, well, that's all the visuals. That's all the excitement. That's all the purging. That's all the feeling of the giant anacondas that come and eat you. Actually, all you need if you're interested in
Mother
healing
ayahuasca, the snake.
right. So it turns out that Banisteriopsis capi is another one of the basic microdosing substances, and at a microdose level seems to be effective
and legal.
Is there any psychoactive nature to it as just the root goes?
Yeah, it has a little bit of properties like an SSRI.
Okay. Oh, okay. Because I was thinking it'll just be then another adaptogen that we see pop up. It'll fall under
well, there
the
is.
ashwagandha, turkey tail,
Yeah,
cordyceps
well,
world.
except that the world of microdose, no one takes turkey tail to overcome ADHD. No one takes turkey tail for cluster headaches. Okay, microdoses seem to have a wider range of effectiveness than any single other mushroom or adaptogen. That's why Paul Stamets is so excited by psilocybin and is still, a wonderful advocate for all kinds of other mushrooms for other things.
I mean, this is great information. I feel like this is so helpful for so many people to get an understanding and also just sort of, I mean, look, let's face it, when THC was legalized, or CBD, sorry, when CBD was legalized initially, everybody thought CBD was drugs. They're like, oh, wow, I'm going to get high if I take CBD. It's like, people get, the propaganda machine has worked wonders on the psyche of mostly Americans, of the dangers of drugs. I appreciate that you guys are trying to sort of show people all the positive benefits.
Just think of something like ADHD, which we talk about in the book. There's something like 80,000 3 to 5-year-olds in the United States prescribed to be on Adderall. Why not try a little bit of microdosing first before you're putting something that they're going to have side effects and they might be on for the rest of their life.
Right. Isn't it like, I feel like it's sometimes called like a low dose, like meth, basically. Like it's like dangerous stuff.
Right.
Oh yeah, all of the stimulant drugs used for ADHD, and there's about 40 on the market. They're all amphetamines, period. As one of the professors of psychopharmacology at Columbia says, they're all speed, and they're a multi-billion-dollar market.
It's so fascinating because they're already like all over the place, and then you give them more speed. I don't know. I've always had this thought that drugs kind of have an interact with the person in the opposite way of their nature. Let's say, like, so if somebody is up, and you give them Adderall, it gets them honed in. Where someone that's kind of down, it brings them up. Or like for me, the reason why I don't like cannabis is because it, normally makes people hungry. No way. I can't even swallow. Like I can't eat food. I'm not hungry. It's not my jam. And then sometimes it makes people more outgoing. I don't even want to talk. I want to be quiet. I feel really dumb. And I feel like I want to sleep, which I don't. I'm not a sleeper. I'm like, I could live off 5 hours a night if my brain could tell me that was healthy enough. So anyway, it makes me the opposite of me, I would say. And I don't know, maybe this is just a curious question, but I don't know if you guys find that or not, but that's what it seems like to me.
We also have people on microdosing that says, gee, it isn't working the way I want it to. And we say, well, then stop. They say, yeah, okay. The other, however, it's a little more tricky. Early on, I get this wonderful email that says, I'm microdosing and I have the following symptoms. What's going on? And they were fairly serious symptoms. And I wrote back and said, stop. And he wrote back and said, you can't make me. Wait a moment. So I said, okay, but I have to, as a researcher and as a person who might like you if I knew you, I recommend you stop because it isn't clearly working for you. Silence for 3 days. And then an email comes, says, I cut the dose in half. All the symptoms went away. From that, this is how we play real science with real people. When people first microdose and they say, it's too strong, it's difficult, I can't sleep, I have a headache, we say, first try half your dose. If that doesn't work, try halving your dose one more time. And if it doesn't work, stop. And this is how we learned that people who started at what we call the low end, say 1/10 of a gram of dried mushroom, that's the bottom of our normal for most people. And the people that said, man, that makes me crazy. And so someone on Reddit said, well, I take 1/10 of a tenth. I take 100th of a gram. If I take more than that, it makes me a little too high. Now,
wow, what a cheap date.
On Reddit, there's 290,000 people on the microdose subreddit. So there's a lot of people with a lot of experience. And a whole bunch of people said to this person, hey, me too. I take a tiny amount. I take 1/10. I take 100. So what we learned is for people who are very sensitive, they should not take what we recommend for most people. They should take less. We have another group who has to take more. And they really puzzled us because they would say, well, this microdosing does nothing for me at 1/10 of a gram, but at half a gram, I have just the same experience as these other people. And what we began to realize, they had something in common. And they may be you too, which is called high functioning autism. And that for reasons that we don't understand, and there's now a wonderful research group in London working with high functioning autistic people, led by a high functioning autistic, brilliant person who microdosed his way to enjoying being a normal person. So we have a whole section about how it affects high functioning people. And they simply need a different place, which again makes total sense that human beings come in a lot of different flavors.
I was going to say the first group is just taking penis envy and it's way too strong.
It also depends on the condition you're taking. Like for the shingles people, we have reports that people are needing to microdose more often when they're having an outbreak of shingles. So it's not just once a day, it's more than that.
Maybe it's working on the actual mitochondria, or maybe it's working on that reducing inflammation because it's so needed based on, yeah, wow. There's so much to be discovered. I mean, I love that. I feel what a time to be alive in so many ways, but I feel like especially in this area, there's just going to be so much more science emerging over time, and also just tolerance and understanding and latitude for the fact that there are other options, and it doesn't all need to necessarily fit into a certain box that it's always fit into from the FDA. It can come in other ways.
Remember, pharmaceuticals are almost all symptom suppressing, that's why you take them every day. You take them and your symptom is suppressed if it's effective. And then the next day you take it again, because once it leaves your body, the symptom says, oh, you're gone, I'm back.
That's how they make their money.
And well, but it's also a method.
Curious, there was something posted a while back. It was like, when was the last time have any of the drug companies actually cured a disease? And it's like, I actually asked the question, is that their job? Is their job to cure the disease or not? Because I'm not sure it really is. And they do a lot of good. It's just whether or not you're a wise enough human to try and actually fix it.
Antibiotics actually work.
Sure.
But most pharmaceuticals are designed for symptom suppression. They're never designed to heal. That's just not what they do.
Yeah.
And what we find in microdosing is the body, however, knows how to heal. Yeah. And if you're basically supporting the body, the healing occurs, which is why we have a wonderful scientist in England. He was a drug czar for a while. He's Professor Nutt, N-U-T-T. And he says, whenever somebody shows me a substance and they say it's good for all kinds of things, I'm really skeptical. And I thought, not only is he right, but we totally agree with him. And so he's actually the heading of one of our chapters. We quote him. If you have that mentality where it's symptom, 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 it makes no sense for the same substance to be helpful. But if you're coming from the other way, body, 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 then it makes perfect sense that if you improve the whole body, then whatever the symptoms are may be alleviated.
And we do expect word to get out and for things to change. In Canada right now, they have an at-home LSD or depression microdosing study going on. At home, no therapists, no big interventions, no high doses. And we'll see how well it works, but I'm guessing it's going to work pretty well, because the rest of our depression reports is that it works really well, including treatment-resistant depression. So, this idea of finding this much simpler, closer to the ground from plant medicine or its derivatives way of healing things that's not suppressing symptoms, but is healing people along these multiple ways we've talked about. It's a pretty radical thought. It's almost too good to be true, except it is true, and that's why we wrote the book.
Remember, the great breakthrough in medicine was not improved surgery. It was not antibiotics. It was washing your hands. That made the most difference in making hospitals someplace where you weren't terrified of dying.
I just heard this story the other day about how the doctor thought he was transferring disease from one patient to another, like energetically. And so he's like, oh, I need to like clean my hands to get rid of the energy of that person. And like, it took decades, but anyway, they finally ended up figuring out it was, cross-contamination from one body to the next. Here's to health. Here's to living in 2025, where we're discovering beautiful things like LSD and psilocybin for healing, and that we actually get to the root cause of things, and we truly heal and reach homeostasis so that we can, all live happy, fun, beautiful lives. Thanks, guys, for your efforts. And
thank you.
This book, it was really fun to read through, like all the anecdotal stories and all of the many, many, many ways that these medicines are helping people's life just totally change. So thanks, Jim. Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to the Pretty Intense podcast today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you heard today and you want to hear more, please click on the subscribe button.